The thermostat on the wall read 40 degrees, but the sweat pooling at the base of my spine felt boiling hot. I wiped my forehead with the back of a gloved hand, leaving a smear of talcum powder on my skin, and looked back down at the Jane Doe on the stainless steel table. I had processed 3 bodies that night, but this one was different. She had been pulled from the river, yet there was no smell of brackish water, only the overwhelming scent of fresh lavender. I reached for the sponge to clean the silt from her shoulder, but stopped. The heavy, industrial door to the hallway clicked. It wasn't the sound of it opening, but the distinct thud of the latch engaging, as if someone had just pulled it shut from the inside. I stared at the handle for 10 seconds. It didn't move. I exhaled, blaming the building's settling foundation, and turned back to the table. The sponge I had placed next to the corpse's hip was gone. My heart did a slow, heavy thump against my ribs. I looked at the floor, expecting to see it there, but the tiles were pristine white and empty. I walked around the table, scanning the metal trays. Nothing. Then I saw it. The sponge was squeezed tight in the Jane Doe's left hand. Her fingers, which had been stiff with rigor mortis 10 minutes ago, were now clamped around the yellow foam so tightly that water was trickling onto the steel. I stepped back, the rubber of my soles squeaking violently in the silence. "Okay," I whispered, my voice sounding too loud in the tiled room. Muscle spasm. Just a spasm. I reached out to pry the sponge loose. Her skin was impossibly cold, colder than the room, colder than the refrigeration units. As I touched her wrist, the fluorescent light above us buzzed aggressively, dimming to a brown, sickly hue before snapping back to full brightness. In that split second of darkness, I felt a puff of warm air against my ear, moist and rhythmic. I jerked back, hitting my hip against the counter of surgical tools. A scalpel tray rattled, the metal-on-metal sound echoing like a gunshot. I stood frozen, scanning the room. The air vent was on the other side of the room. There was no explanation for that breath. I looked back at the body. The sponge was on the floor now. It hadn't fallen. It lay 3 feet away as if tossed. I needed to get her into the cooler. Protocol be damned. I wasn't finishing the prep. I grabbed a sheet to cover her. As I pulled the white linen up over her legs, I noticed the water, a perfect, wet footprint on the dry floor, pointing toward the table, not away from it. The print was small, barefoot, and the water was dark and muddy. My hand shook as I pulled the sheet over her face. The fabric clung to her features instantly, outlining the nose and mouth, but as it settled, the chest cavity didn't look right. It was rising, slowly. I held my breath. The sheet rose again a fraction of an inch, and held there. It wasn't breathing. It was as if something under the rib cage was pushing up against the skin. I grabbed the release on the gurney, my fingers slipping on the cold metal. I pushed the table toward the cooler bay, the wheels clattering unevenly. The sound of the wheels masked at first, but when I stopped at the cooler door, I heard it clearly, a rhythmic dripping sound. It was coming from inside the assigned drawer, Unit 4. It was supposed to be empty. I stared at the brushed steel handle of Unit 4. The condensation on the metal wasn't cold mist. It was running in rivulets, like the metal was sweating. I didn't want to open it, but I had to put her somewhere. I gripped the latch. It was warm, not room temperature, but fever warm to the touch. I pulled the lever. The door swung open with a hiss of air that smelled violently of river mud and decay, the smell that had been missing from the body. The tray slid out empty. I shoved the gurney alongside it to transfer the body. I grabbed a sheet to slide her over, but the weight was wrong. It was too light. I whipped the sheet back. The Jane Doe was there, but her eyes were open. They were milky, clouded with death, yet they were focused sharply on the corner of the room where I had been standing moments ago. And then, the intercom on the wall, a system that had been disconnected for 2 years, crackled with static. A low, wet gurgle came to the speaker, followed by a voice that sounded like it was speaking through a mouthful of water. "It's cold." The heavy door to the hallway clicked again. The latch turned, slowly. I abandoned the gurney. I backed away toward the office cubicle, the glass-walled enclosure that served as the only barrier between the administrative world and the visceral reality of the prep room. The door to the office was propped open with a rubber wedge. As I retreated, I kept my eyes on the hallway door handle. It was rotating, grinding against the internal mechanism. I slipped into the office and kicked the wedge away. The door swung shut and I locked it. My breath was fogging up the glass almost instantly. I reached for the landline phone on the desk to call security, just to have someone else come down here. There was no dial tone, just a faint, high-pitched whining noise, like feedback from a microphone left too close to the speaker. I looked through the glass. The prep room was still. The Jane Doe lay uncovered on the gurney, her head turned toward the office. I could have sworn I left her head facing up. A shadow moved across the floor of the prep room. It didn't come from the overhead lights. It was a dense, independent mass of darkness that slid out from underneath the gurney. It pooled on the white tiles, darker than a shadow should be. The lights in the prep room flickered again. This time, they didn't just dim. They went out completely. The only light came from the small desk lamp in my office, casting a weak, yellow cone illumination that barely reached the glass partition. I pressed my face closer to the glass, trying to see into the dark. Something slammed against the glass right in front of my face. I recoiled, falling back into the office chair, which rolled and hit the filing cabinet behind me. A handprint, wet, muddy, and impossibly large, was smeared on the other side of the glass. It began to slide down, leaving a trail of silt. I scrambled up and backed into the corner of the small office. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. I could hear the hum of the computer tower under the desk, but beyond the glass, the silence was absolute. Then, the sound of the gurney wheels returned. It was moving. In the pitch black of the prep room, the gurney was being pushed. The sound got louder, approaching the office glass. It stopped inches away. I couldn't see it, but I could feel the proximity. A scratching sound started on the glass. Slow, deliberate scratches, like a fingernail trying to find a purchase on the smooth surface. I grabbed a heavy brass letter opener from the desk. It was a useless weapon, but the weight of it in my hand was grounding. "Who's there?" I yelled. My voice cracked. The scratching stopped. A moment later, the overhead lights in the prep room buzzed back on, blindingly bright. The gurney was right in front of the window, but the Jane Doe was gone. The sheet was balled up in the center of the tray. I scanned the room. The door to the hallway, the one whose handle had been turning, was wide open. I had to leave. I couldn't stay in the glass box. The only exit from the basement was through that hallway. I unlocked the office door, my hands slippery with sweat. I pushed it open and stepped onto the tiles. The air was freezing now. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees. I could see my breath pluming in front of me. I walked toward the hallway door, keeping my back to the wall. I passed a row of sinks. The faucet on the middle sink turned on. Full blast. The water hammered against the stainless steel basin, roaring in the quiet room. I didn't stop to turn it off. I kept moving. As I reached the threshold of the hallway, I looked down. A trail of wet footprints led out of the room and down the corridor. They were the same small, bare footprints I had seen earlier, but intermingled with them were other prints. Large, heavy boot prints. Muddy, like the handprint on the glass. I stepped into the corridor. The fluorescent tubes overhead stretched out into the distance, flickering in a sequence that made the hallway look like it was pulsing. I started to walk, fast. The elevator was 40 yards away. Behind me, from the prep room, I heard the crash of a metal tray hitting the floor, then the sound of instruments scattering, scalpels, scissors, bone saws, skittering across the tiles. I broke into a run. The hallway seemed to stretch. The elevator doors didn't look any closer. The lights overhead popped one by one as I passed under them, showering sparks that fizzled out before they hit the floor. I reached the elevator and jabbed the call button. The arrow lit up. B, basement. It was already here. The doors didn't open. I hit the button again. And again, from down the hall, back toward the morgue, a shadow detached itself from the wall. It stood in the center of the corridor, tall and indistinct, a silhouette of static. The elevator chimed. A cheerful, normal sound. The door slid open. I threw myself inside and hit the button for the lobby. The doors began to close. As the gap narrowed, I saw the silhouette move. It didn't walk. It glided, covering 20 yards a second. Just as the door sealed, a hand reached through the gap. It wasn't a spectral hand. It was a physical, gray, decaying hand. It gripped the edge of the safety rubber. The door sensed the obstruction and began to reopen. I kicked the hand. It felt like kicking a bag of wet cement. The fingers didn't recoil. They gripped harder. The door was opening. I scrambled to the back of the elevator, pressing myself against the railing. The doors opened fully. Standing there was a man. He was wearing a dripping wet suit, outdated, maybe from the 70s. His skin was bloated, waterlogged, peeling away from the bone in strips. But his eyes were the worst part. They weren't dead. They were bright, terrified, and human. He didn't attack. He looked at me, and then he looked down at his own hand, the one gripping the door. He looked confused. "Help me," he rasped. The voice was the same one from the intercom. Behind him, the Jane Doe, the small woman from the river, walked out of the darkness. She looked perfectly normal now, aside from the autopsy Y incision visible at the neckline of the hospital gown I hadn't put on her. She walked up to the waterlogged man and placed a hand on his shoulder. He screamed. It wasn't a scream of pain, but of absolute despair. The lights in the elevator died. Total darkness. I could hear them breathing. Two distinct patterns. One wet and ragged, the other soft and shallow. The elevator lurched upward. We were moving. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, intending to use the flashlight. My fingers brushed against fabric that wasn't my own. A wet wool suit sleeve. I froze. Going up, a voice whispered right into my ear. It was a woman's voice. The elevator shuddered and stopped. We weren't at the lobby. The sensation of gravity suggested we hadn't moved more than a few feet. The emergency light in the corner of the ceiling flickered on, a dim, red bulb that cast long, bloody shadows. I was alone in the elevator. The waterlogged man and the Jane Doe were gone, but the floor of the cab was covered in water, inches deep, and floating in the water, bobbing gently against my shoes, was a yellow sponge. I stared at it. The sponge compressed, as if invisible fingers were squeezing it. A stream of water shot out, hitting my pant leg. The doors opened. I wasn't on the ground floor. I was back in the basement. But it wasn't the hallway I had just left. The walls were brick, not drywall. The floor was dirt, not tile. I looked at the display panel. The buttons were gone, just smooth metal. I stepped out because the water in the elevator was rising. It was bubbling up from the floor seams, filling the small cab rapidly. I stepped onto the dirt floor. The air here was thick, smelling of earth and roots. I turned back to the elevator, but the doors slammed shut. I heard the cable snap, a sharp, metallic ping followed by the whistling sound of the cab plummeting down a shaft that shouldn't be that deep. The crash, when it came, was distant, miles below. I turned my phone flashlight on. The beam cut through the dusty air. I was in a tunnel, an old service tunnel. I started walking. There was nowhere else to go. Every 20 paces, I heard footsteps behind me. I would stop, and they would stop, not instantly, but one step later than me. An echo with a delay. I walked faster. The delay shortened. I saw a door ahead, an old wooden door with peeling green paint. I ran to it. It was locked. I hammered on the wood. "Hello? Is anyone there?" On the other side of the door, a radio turned on. It was playing jazz music. Soft, scratchy 1940s jazz. I grabbed the rusted knob and twisted. It broke off of my hand. The footsteps behind me were loud now, slapping against the dirt. I put my eye to the keyhole of the green door. Inside, I saw a room that looked like a living room. There was a fire in the hearth, and sitting in a wingback chair, facing away from me, was the man in the wet suit. He was dry now. His hair was combed. He was holding a sponge. He was squeezing it into a cup of tea. "Come in, Arthur," he said. He knew my name. I backed away from the door. The footsteps behind me stopped. I turned around. Standing inches from my face was the Jane Doe. Her mouth was sewn shut with thick, black twine. Her eyes were gone, replaced by empty black sockets that seemed to suck the light from my phone. She raised a hand and pointed at the green door. The lock clicked. The door creaked open inward. The heat from the fire hit me. It was welcoming. Too welcoming. I didn't want to go in, but the darkness in the tunnel was pressing against me, physical and heavy. It was pushing me. I stepped into the room. The door slammed shut behind me. The jazz music stopped abruptly. The man in the chair stood up and turned around. It wasn't the waterlogged man anymore. It was me. It was me, wearing my scrubs, looking tired, with talcum powder on my forehead. He looked at me with sad eyes. "You're late for the shift," he said. He walked past me, toward the door I had just entered. He opened it, and instead of the tunnel, I saw the gleaming white hallway of the morgue. He stepped out. "Wait!" I yelled. I ran to the door, but he shut it. I heard the latch engage. I pounded on the wood. "Let me out." Through the wood, I heard my own voice muffled. The thermostat on the wall read 40 degrees. I backed away. I was in the room. The fire was fake. It was just orange lights and fluttering silk. The books on the shelves were painted blocks of wood. I looked at the chair. The sponge was there. I picked it up. It was dry. Bone dry. Then I noticed the wall. The wallpaper was peeling. Underneath, it wasn't plaster. It was stainless steel. I tore at the paper. Huge strips came away. It wasn't a room. It was a box. A large metal box. The ceiling began to lower. A mechanical hum vibrated through the floor. I looked up. The ceiling wasn't ceiling. It was the underside of a drawer mechanism. I was inside the cooler unit. I screamed, scratching at the metal walls. The space compressed. The furniture was crushed, splintering into nothingness. I curled into a ball in the center of the shrinking space. The darkness came, absolute and freezing. Then, a click. Light flooded in. I squinted against the brightness. A face loomed over me. A giant face. It was a doctor. He was wearing a mask. "Time of death, 3:42 a.m., he said. He wasn't talking to me. He was looking at me. But looking through me, I sat up. I tried to grab his arm. My hand passed through his coat like smoke. I looked down. My body was on the table. My face was pale, eyes fixed on the ceiling. There was a sponge in my left hand. Squeezed tight. Massive cardiac arrest. The doctor said. Must have happened right at the start of the shift. I stood next to the table. I was vibrating. "No," I said. I processed 3 bodies. I saw the Jane Doe. The doctor pulled a sheet over my face. "Get him to the cooler," he told the orderly. The orderly nodded. He looked tired. He looked familiar. It was the waterlogged man, but he was dry, alive, wearing scrubs. He looked right at me, the spirit me standing next to the table, and winked. He grabbed the gurney release. I backed away toward the hallway door. The orderly pushed my body toward Unit 4. I turned and ran for the door. I grabbed the handle. It was solid. I could touch it. I pulled. It didn't budge. I heard the orderly whistling that jazz tune. "You can't leave, Arthur," the orderly said, not looking up from my corpse. "You haven't finished the paperwork." I rattled the door. "I'm dead. I don't have to do paperwork." The orderly stopped the gurney. He turned slowly. His face rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. For a second, he was the rotting corpse again. "Everyone pays rent," he gurgled. The lights flickered. The room plunged into darkness. When the emergency lights pulsed on, the orderly was gone. My body was gone from the gurney. The room was empty, except for the sound. Drip, drip, drip. It was coming from Unit 4. I walked toward it. I knew I shouldn't, but the compulsion was like a hook in my navel. I reached for the handle. My hand shook. I opened it. There was no body inside, just a clipboard. I picked it up. It was an intake form. The name at the top was mine. Under cause of death, it was blank. A pen rolled out of the back of the drawer and stopped at the edge. I picked up the pen. It was wet. "Fill out," a voice whispered from the drain in the floor. I uncapped the pen. Ink leaked onto my fingers. It was red. I started to write. The door to the hallway clicked. I froze. The handle turned. I wasn't alone. Someone was coming in for their shift. I dropped the clipboard into the drawer and scrambled backward, sliding into the shadow between the cabinets. The door opened. A man walked in. He looked young, nervous. He was adjusting his gloves. He walked to the thermostat and tapped it. 40 degrees, he muttered. Feels hotter. He looked at the empty table. Hello, he called out. I stayed in the shadows. I felt a hunger in my stomach that wasn't hunger. It was cold. I needed warmth. The young man walked past my hiding spot. I could smell the blood pumping in his veins. It smelled like lavender. I reached out. My hand was gray. He stopped. He looked around. Is someone there? He asked. I held my breath. He turned back to his work. He reached for a sponge on the counter. I moved faster than I ever could in life. I swiped the sponge before his hand could close around it. He blinked. He looked at the empty counter. He looked at the floor. I was standing right behind him. I leaned in close to his ear. It's cold, I whispered. He jumped, spinning around, knocking a tray of instruments to the floor. The crash was deafening. He stared right at me, but he didn't see me. He was looking through me. Just the pipes, he said, his voice trembling. Just the pipes? He bent down to pick up the scalpel. I looked at the open door of Unit 4. The clipboard was waiting. I knew what I had to do. I had to finish the shift. But I needed help. I looked at the young man's neck, exposed and warm above his collar. I placed my cold hand on his shoulder. He screamed. The lights went out. The darkness lasted for an eternity, or maybe a second. When the buzz of the electricity returned, the young man was on the floor, scrambling backward on his elbows like a crab. He was staring at the corner of the ceiling. Get away, he shrieked. I looked up. There was nothing there. Then I realized he wasn't looking at the ceiling. He was looking at the reflection in the safety mirror mounted there. I looked at the mirror. I wasn't gray. I wasn't fading. I was a towering mass of black static, human-shaped but vibrating with a violent energy. And behind me, filling the room, were dozens of others. The waterlogged man, the Jane Doe, burned victims, car crash fatalities. They were all standing in the room, forming a circle around the young man. We were the night shift. The young man grabbed a bone saw from the floor. He swung it wildly at the air. The blade passed through the Jane Doe's leg. She didn't flinch. She just smiled, the stitches in her mouth stretching. Join us, the collective voices whispered. It wasn't sound. It was a vibration in the dental fillings, a hum in the bone marrow. The young man scrambled to his feet and ran for the office. He slammed the door and locked it. I walked to the glass. I placed my hand on it. The black static of my form stained the glass. He was dialing the phone. I knew the line was dead. I remembered. He looked up at me. His eyes were wide, filled with the same terror I had felt. He dropped the phone. He looked at the vent in the ceiling of the office. He climbed onto the desk. He kicked the grate open. Don't, I said. He couldn't hear me. Or maybe he could, and that's why he moved faster. He pulled himself into the vent. I watched his legs disappear. I looked at the others in the room. The waterlogged man shrugged. We waited. A minute passed. Then a scream echoed through the ventilation system. It was a tight metallic sound, reverberating through ductwork. Then a thud. Then silence. A moment later, a fluid began to drip from the vent above the main table. Dark, thick fluid. It hit the stainless steel with a heavy plat. I walked over to the table. The fluid pooled. It wasn't blood. It was ink. The door to the hallway opened. 2 paramedics wheeled in a gurney. On it was a body bag. Found him in the air ducts, one paramedic said. Got stuck. Suffocated. Weirdest thing, though. What? The other asked, transferring the bag to the table. He was clutching this. The paramedic held up a yellow sponge. They left the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind them. I looked at the bag. I looked at the other ghosts. They were fading back into the shadows, into the drains, into the cooler units. I was alone with the bag. I reached out and unzipped it. The young man's face was blue. His eyes were open. He blinked. He looked at me. He saw me. "Am I?" he started. "You're late," I said. I pointed to the mop in the corner. "Floor's dirty." He looked at his hands. He looked at the room. He stood up. His body remained on the table, lifeless. But he stood up. He walked to the mop. I walked to Unit 4. I took the clipboard out. I erased my name. I wrote his name. I put the pen back. I walked to the hallway door. I grabbed the handle. It turned. I pushed the door open. The corridor wasn't the hospital basement anymore. It was a field of tall grass, swaying in a warm breeze. The sun was shining. I stepped out. The warmth hit my face. The smell of lavender was real this time. I didn't look back. Behind me, the door clicked shut. Inside the room, the young man started mopping. The thermostat on the wall read 40 degrees.